Caro, buenos dias, good morning, and welcome to the Immigrant Whisperer Podcast. I am your hostess, Dr. Janet Awokoya, aka Dr. J, and I invite you to join me on this journey of exploring the lives of immigrants, particularly Black immigrants in the United States. In this episode, we delve into Chapter 3 of my dissertation research, I'm Not Enough of Anything, focusing specifically on the identity construction and negotiations of 1.5 and second generation Nigerian college students in the Washington, D.C. area. To provide a more in-depth analysis, we'll be splitting Chapter 3 into two parts. In this first part, we'll explore how I collected data on these young adults who are navigating their racial and ethnic identities within the dynamic DC landscape through individual interviews and focus groups. In part 2 of Chapter 3, we'll meet the research participants from my dissertation study and explore their experiences coming of age as 1.5 and second generation Nigerian college students in Washington, D.C. Before I begin reading Chapter 3, I want to tell you about my book, Some Black Girls Don't Sit Together in the Cafeteria. In this story, we follow Oluwaseyi, a young Nigerian girl navigating life in America as she grapples with cultural identity, academic aspirations, and the pursuit of belonging. Shei's story is a beacon of resilience and strength, showcasing the remarkable contributions of African immigrant youth to our school communities. Also, I encourage you to support Black education and literacy by purchasing a Black Girls and Boys Read t-shirt from our website and empower the next generation of Black leaders. Together, we can create a world where every child has the opportunity to thrive. Please see the links in the descriptions below. Now, back to Episode 3, Chapter 3, Part 1, Unveiling the Fabric of Identity, a qualitative research methodology for understanding African immigrant youth. Chapter 3, Methodology and Research Design. In this chapter, I describe the overall methodological approach of this study, including the research design, the setting and participants, data collection and analysis, and the limitations of the study. This qualitative study was guided by 4 broad research questions. 1. How do 1.5 and second generation Nigerian college students describe and experience their interactions with Africans, peers, family, and school personnel, and non-African peers? How do they describe and experience their processes of racial and ethnic identity development? 3. How do their interactions with Africans and non-Africans shape their racial and ethnic identity development? 4. How do they negotiate their racial and ethnic identities among Africans and non-Africans? Research methodology. According to Cresswell, 1998, qualitative study is an inquiry process of understanding a social or human problem based on building a complex, holistic picture formed with words reporting detailed views of informants and conducted in a natural setting. Page 15. This study uses qualitative methods in order to explore the lived experiences of 1.5 and second generation Nigerians' identity construction, Qualitative methodology is particularly appropriate for this study for 5 primary reasons. First, a qualitative approach is appropriate when examining a phenomenon that is not well understood. Cresswell, 1998. Thus far, much of the research on Black immigrants has focused primarily on the social, economic, and political experiences of Caribbean immigrants. There is scant research available on the lived experiences of Africans in general and African youth in particular. Several scholars have pointed out this limitation within the literature and have called for qualitative studies that explore the sociocultural experiences of Africans in the U.S. context. Harushabana, 2007, Kamya, 1997. Second, qualitative research seeks to answer questions about how social experience is created and given meaning. Denson and Lincoln, 2000, page 8. This requires eliciting the experiences of the participants so others can understand participants' experiences and perceptions. Denson and Lincoln, 2000, from their frame of reference. This was important to my study as I sought to understand Nigerian college students' own perceptions of and experiences with others, and how it was connected to the ways in which they constructed their racial and ethnic identities. Third, qualitative research emphasizes collecting and presenting rich descriptions of the participants' experiences. In doing so, I describe the perceptions and experiences of my participants by extensively using their voices and interpretations to support my interpretations of the data. Fourth, contextualizing data is an essential process in qualitative research, which allows the researcher to situate the participants' experiences in order to make sense of the data. Miles and Huberman, 1994. Contextualization was necessary in this study because I sought to capture the complex manner in which the participants constructed their racial and ethnic identities in their interactions with others. As such, qualitative data and analyses allowed me to identify, contextualize, and gain a deep understanding of the personal and social processes and the shifting constraints and opportunities that the participants encountered in these interactions. Lastly, qualitative research values self-reflection in the research process. Merriam, 2002, page 119. Which compelled me to make sense of my own experiences as a Nigerian immigrant in light of the experiences of my informants. Since I am the primary instrument, Maxwell, 1996, in the collection and analysis of the data, being reflective enabled me to understand my own positionality in relation to my participants' stories and to make my assumptions explicit and to understand how they might influence my interpretations explicitly. Schramm, 2003. Site selection. The D.C. metropolitan area is a prime location to study the racial and ethnic identity construction and negotiations among Nigerian immigrants. Washington, D.C., colloquially referred to as Chocolate City, due to its sizable Black community, has attracted Blacks from diverse social and cultural backgrounds because of its political and economic opportunities, higher education institutions, and its diverse ethnic population. Selassie, 2003. Historically, the Black population in the area was comprised mostly of Black Americans. However, within the last decade, Black immigrants from Africa have numerically increased in the area. In fact, of all major U.S. cities, the D.C. metropolitan area has the highest concentration of African immigrants. Dean and Logan, 2003. Though demographers disagree if peoples from sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Sierra Leone, or from the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, dominate the area, Selassie 2003. Reports from the 2000 census data and recent news articles reveal that the Nigerian population has increased significantly in this region of the country and is currently the largest African population in the United States. Baltimore Sun, 2005, Dean and Logan, 2003. Participant selection. This qualitative study explored the experiences of 11 1.5 and second generation undergraduate and graduate students of Nigerian descent. I chose Nigerians because they represent a significant number of the African population in the U.S. Wilson, 2003. Further, I have a proficient understanding of Nigerian customs, the Yoruba language, and Pidgin English, which helped me to build rapport and communicate with participants. Kamia, 1997. Participants in this study were young adults between the ages of 18 to 32. Within this age range, individuals are often engaged in self-exploration and identity issues. Seidel, 1994. It is also a period often associated with establishing independence from family and the co-ethnic community. As young adults, participants were able to reflect upon, describe, and explain a variety of interactions and negotiations with Africans and non-Africans, and they impacted their racial and ethnic identity development. Miles and Huberman, 1994, explained that qualitative sampling is often a purposeful and theory-driven process. My rationale for limiting the sample to this particular population is multifaceted. First, while a growing body of literature focuses on racial and ethnic identity assertions among first-generation Black immigrants, Candelario, 2002, Fauner, 1985, Vickerman, 1999, few studies address this process for younger Black immigrants who have spent most or all of their developmental years in the United States. Even fewer studies on Black immigrants from African countries are available. Second, the sample size is based on McCracken's 1988 recommendation that in qualitative research, less is more, page 17, and what is most pertinent is having participants contribute to existing literature and allows the researcher to examine their experiences in greater depth. According to the selection criteria, participants 1. Were between the ages of 18 to 32, 2. Were born in Nigeria, 3. Came to the U.S. under the age of 12, 1.5 generation, or were born and raised in the United States, second generation, and 4. Were born to a Nigerian mother and father who have resided in the U.S. for a minimum of 15 years. Also, the 11 participants chosen for this study were college students, which is often marked as a time period of greater self-exploration. Recruitment and selection of participants. During the spring 2008 semester, I distributed a recruitment email to the Office of Multicultural Student Education, African Student Association, Black Students Association, Black Engineers Society, Black MBA Association, Multicultural Involvement and Community Advocacy, and the Numburu Cultural Center. See Appendix A. To invite qualified students to participate in the study. These entities all cater to the needs of historically marginalized and minority students on campus. I intentionally excluded the Office of International Education Services because it caters specifically to first-generation immigrant international students who generally have limited residence in the United States. This email correspondence served as a screening tool that determined appropriate age, national affiliation, and generational status. This strategy yielded 5 participants interested in the study.
I then relied on a snowball sample from the eligible respondents from the initial recruitment email, and also consulted university officials, friends, and acquaintances and asked them to recommend potential participants. Further, I gave a brief presentation to the African Student Association where I introduced myself and my research topic. Through the snowball sample and my brief presentation at the African Student Association, I secured an additional 6 participants from the target university as well as nearby universities. Interested and qualified participants were invited to face-to-face informational sessions during which I introduced myself, described the research topic, confirmed their interest in participating, ensured that they met the selection criteria, and discussed the logistics of the study. Identified the risks and benefits associated with participating, and emphasized their right to withdraw from the study at any time. After the presentation, interested individuals were asked to read and sign 2 copies of my IRB-approved informed consent form, see Appendix B. 1 copy was kept in each participant's file, and the second was given to each participant. The participants were asked to fill out a demographic questionnaire, see Appendix C, to begin the data collection process. Data collection. I employed 3 primary data collection methods to produce the core set of data for this study: questionnaires, interviews, and a focus group. I recorded my personal processes, e.g., questions, reflections, issues, and decisions, reactions to the data, and the ideas in a research diary. These different sources of data collection allowed for contextualizing and triangulation. Maxwell, 1996. Questionnaires. I administered a background information questionnaire to each of my 11 participants, see Appendix C, to solicit basic socio-demographic information such as gender, age, language ability, family, and cultural background. The questionnaire also provided a foundation from which I identified salient topics that would be discussed in the interviews. The items on this questionnaire were adapted from previous questionnaires used in studies of immigrant youth, Clark, 2006, Prosper, 2006. Interviews. Qualitative researchers argue that interviews are critical in documenting informants' experiences. Patton, 1990, Seidman, 2006, Yin, 2003. While the questionnaire adapted for this study produced descriptive data on the demographics of the participants, interviews helped to illuminate the processes and identify the factors that they believed influenced how they constructed and negotiated their racial and ethnic identities. This study used semi-structured interviews to provide informants the flexibility to relay their experiences as they understood them. The interview included some questions used in other immigrant studies on race and ethnicity, which I believe were particularly relevant to the present study. Kim, 2001, Portes and Rumbault, 2001, Prosper, 2006. Some questions included: describe some key experiences with peers in elementary school, high school, and college. How has it impacted the way you see yourself or the way you think about yourself? To test the clarity of the interview questions, I piloted the interview protocol on family members and friends who met the participation criteria, focusing particularly on language use and structure. I then modified the interview guide based on their recommendations. Patton, 1990. Interviews were conducted in locations determined by the participants at their convenience and were digitally recorded. During the interviews, I wrote descriptive field notes to capture major cues, verbal and nonverbal, related to the research. I also wrote analytic memos, Maxwell, 1996, to record my interpretations of participants' statements. According to Bogdan and Bicklin, 1998, Such notes allow the researcher to document the process of the study and to consider the impact of the data on both the study and on the researcher's interpretations. All interviews were conducted in English. However, based on previous studies on immigrant youth, I anticipated that some participants would use a Nigerian language to describe or reference particular topics. Prosper, 2006. In fact, several of the participants in the study did use Yoruba, Igbo, or Pidgin English to refer to a particular concept or cultural expression. In these situations, I asked the participant to translate into English if I did not understand the language, or I did so myself in the transcriptions. I had originally planned for the interviews to be two 90-minute interviews. In discussing the benefit of multiple interviews, Seidman 2006 argues that single interviews do not allow participants the opportunity to contextually ground and construct meaning from their experiences. Thus, I wanted to interview each participant 2 times in order to provide informants with a contextual foundation and also to gain their trust, particularly when discussing personal subjects such as one's family background, upbringing, and personal struggles. However, participants' time constraints and obligations did not always allow me to conduct the interviews in 2 separate sessions or in 90-minute blocks. Instead, the interviews ranged from 1 hour to 2.5 hours. 8 out of the 11 interviews occurred in 2 different sessions. From a total of 12 participants, 1 dropped out because of personal obligations. The final data set for analysis included 19 interviews. The interview protocol, Appendix D, included probing questions that allowed me to delve further into responses that required additional elaboration. The interview began by my encouraging participants to reconstruct their past lives, specifically focusing on their immigration to the United States and/or early childhood and adolescent experiences as a child of Nigerian immigrants born in the United States. It began with the open-ended statement, "Tell me about your immigration here. At what age did you arrive in the United States?" Or, "Tell me about your experiences in school as a child of African immigrants." See Appendix D. The goal of the interview was to allow participants to expand on their responses to the questionnaire. The second interview, or the second phase of the interview, focused on the participants' recent and present experiences with family members and peers related to their racial and ethnic identities in various social contexts. In this phase, I sought to understand the types of relational experiences they had which they believe impacted their identities. In the last phase of interviewing, designed to be included in the second interview, I encouraged participants to reflect on the meaning of their experiences. Seidman, 2006, page 18. In this phase, I gave participants the opportunity to identify and reflect upon those factors that they believed had significantly impacted their present racial and ethnic identities and the ways in which they negotiated those identities. After each interview with the participants, I reviewed each audio tape, taking analytic notes and identifying particular points to be addressed or expounded upon in the subsequent interview or later phone conversation. I also used the analytic memos to explicate relationships and identify topics to follow up on. In the case of those participants who were formally interviewed only once, I was not able to follow up on issues that arose during the initial interview with the second interview. For those participants, I followed up with phone calls to get further elaboration. I initially began transcribing interviews myself to analyze the data. However, I later hired a transcription company to transcribe the majority of the interviews. After the transcriptions were returned to me, I read over them 2 times while listening to the corresponding audio recording to make sure that they were accurate. Focus group. According to Stewart et al. 2007, focus groups are particularly useful in research that is exploratory in nature and when the phenomenon being examined is understudied, as was the case in this study. I conducted one 2-hour focus group with 7 participants who were interested and available to participate in the session. The focus group had 2 primary goals. First, I wanted to further explore recurring patterns found in the interview sessions by having participants listen and respond to each other's experiences and perceptions. Group interactions and focus groups were particularly useful and necessary for this study because they allowed informants to discuss their experiences and thoughts concerning their personal constructions and negotiations of their racial and ethnic identity with other Africans. The focus group allowed me as the researcher to observe how my participants reacted to and built on the responses of other discussants, which in certain cases was not expressed in the one-on-one interviews. Reactions were not limited to verbal responses, but included nonverbal cues, e.g., smiles, frowns, gestures. Furthermore, the focus group session unearthed different views and experiences, helping me to better understand why participants might endorse, be ambivalent to, or reject the experiences of their counterparts. The second goal of the focus group was to pose critical incidents, see Appendix E, to the group. Respondents were given a detailed account of an incident that is critical by virtue of being important to the respondents with respect to the research topic, as ascertained from the questionnaire and interviews. Erlandson, 1993, explains that a critical incident should contain 4 basic elements. 1, it should contain only one event or chief descriptions. 2, it should identify persons, locations, and times as specifically as possible. 3, it should either be observed by the writer or be verifiable by more than one source. 4, it should help define the operation of the organization by focusing on either a typical event or one that is distinctively atypical, page 105. Based on data from the one-on-one interviews, I constructed 4 composite incidents and posed and encouraged dialogue around the incidents during the focus group sessions. The critical incidents developed were used to pursue 4 major goals. 1, to gain more information on a particular theme. 2, to further explore a theme that was discussed in noticeably different ways by the participants. 3, to further explore experiences that were prevalent across participants. 4, to see if participants would give a different response to issues in the group that they did in the individual interviews and to understand why that might be. The critical incidents provided an alternative means to capture the participants' stories and experiences. They provided a venue through which participants identified shared experiences, discussed the ways in which they mentally and or emotionally constructed their reactions to these experiences, and discussed strategies they employed to negotiate and cope during and after these experiences. In the focus group session, the participants were asked to reflect on experiences and to consider their feelings in that moment. Responses to the critical incidents were used to deepen my understanding of participants' experiences and perceptions and strengthen my interpretations of the data. The focus group, which included the examination of critical incidents, took place on campus after all interviews had been conducted and transcribed, and some preliminary analysis of them had been done. The focus group was video and audio taped, and breakfast was provided. Participants were seated in a roundtable format to allow participants to view and react to each other. Participants were informed beforehand about the goal of the focus group and reminded at the outset of the session that they would be video and audio taped. Data analysis. Data analysis was a multi-level, ongoing, and iterative process. Bogdan and Bicklin, 1998, Maxwell, 1996, Miles and Huberman, 1994. As I collected data, I began to transcribe interviews using word processing software as they came in, read over transcriptions, and began to make initial analyses using preliminary codes. I transcribed 2 interviews, and the remainder of the interviews were transcribed by a professional transcription service. Once I received the transcripts, I reviewed them for accuracy. Transcriptions were stored as digital text files and entered into NVivo for analysis. This qualitative data analysis software assists the researcher in organizing, analyzing, and managing data. I also printed backup copies of the transcripts and stored them in files that were dated and labeled using participants' pseudonyms. I viewed the focus group video, took field notes, and transcribed the audio from them. I also wrote up my field notes from the interviews in narrative form, and they were used as additional data. Then I gathered all of the transcriptions, questionnaires, and analytic memos, my research diary, and the field notes, and read them in their entirety, after which they were entered into NVivo for analysis. I coded all of the data using deductive and inductive strategies. I used deductive codes drawn from previous studies to capture factors and experiences that have been found to impact the racial and ethnic identity experiences of immigrant youth. These included racial discrimination on 1999, Finney et al., 2001b, ethnic prejudice, Stepik, 1998, Zephyr, 2001, parental acculturation style, Quintana and Vera, 1999, and intergenerational conflict, Zephyr, 2001. Inductive codes captured experiences that were significant to the participants themselves, which at times were not accounted for in existing literature, Maxwell, 1996. For instance, several participants discussed being viewed as exotic within the schooling context and during one-on-one interactions with non-Africans. Another example was participants' discussion of the racialized obligation they felt to identify and associate with their Black peers. This coded, for example, as the force. I looked for patterns among the codes both within and across participants' data. I first coded data by participant to understand how each participant experienced their interactions with other Africans and how they perceived their own race and ethnicity. For instance, Amma explained that the college context gave her an opportunity to interact with other second-generation Nigerians that shared her identity experiences. As such, she found herself very active in the African Student Association, ASA. In contrast, Uzama found that the authenticity of her Nigerianness was often questioned during interactions with other Africans, particularly when she joined ASA her freshman year in college. Her discomfort during these social interactions influenced her leaving ASA to join the Black Student Association, BSA. She believed that BSA was more open to Black people of various ethnicities and experiences. Next, I examined the data across participants. The goal was to identify similarities and differences and interpret any patterns or themes across informants' data. It was through cross-case analysis that I analyzed differences in experiences as found in Amma and Uzama's experiences. For example, several other participants shared several experiences of feeling excluded during their participation in ASA. One pattern that emerged that was significance of ethnic identity exploration and affirmation through ASA. Then I arranged the patterns into broader preliminary categories and placed them on matrices. At this point, I worked with my dissertation committee members and other doctoral students to examine the validity of the patterns I identified and categories I developed. Murphy, 1980, argues that feedback from a neutral colleague is helpful in covering biases, identifying discrepant data, and sharpening arguments that someone steeped in the analysis may not readily see. The final steps of data analysis involved determining themes to further explain the phenomenon. Validity. According to Merriam and Associates 2002, the quintessential question in discussions concerning internal validity is how congruent are one's findings with reality? They assert that qualitative research assumes two major ideas in addressing internal validity. First, reality is shifting, dynamic, and individually constructed. Second, the researcher serves as the primary instrument for data collection and analysis. Considering that these two ideas are intricately related, the findings are essentially the researcher's interpretations of the participants' realities. In reflecting on this, I believe that a potential threat to the validity of my study was my difficulty in separating my own assumptions and experiences from my participants' realities and its potential to influence my participants' responses to the interview questions or my interpretations of the data. To address this, I employed three strategies: triangulation of multiple forms of data, member checks, and peer review. According to Merriam and Associates 2002, multiple methods of collecting data can be seen as a strategy for obtaining consistent and dependable data, as well as data that are most congruent with reality as understood by the participants. Page 27. In my study, three data collection methods were used: questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups. Information from the interviews was checked against information provided in the focus group and reported in the questionnaire to confirm emerging findings and interpretations. I also conducted member checks, asking participants to review interview transcriptions and comment on my interpretations of the data to ensure that my interpretation rings true. Merriam and Associates, 2002, to their experiences. Lastly, while analyzing the data, I consistently discussed my interpretations of the data with my dissertation committee and incorporated feedback as necessary. Limitations. Although this research contributes to the empirical research literature on African immigrants, it has several limitations. First, the sample size in this research investigation is relatively small, n equals 11, which is common in qualitative research. Thus, the findings of this study are not generalizable to 1.5 and second-generation immigrants in general, or 1.5 and second-generation Nigerians in particular. A second limitation is that the participants were volunteers attending various universities and not randomly selected from the greater population. By focusing on this specific population, this study captured experiences specifically related to college-going Nigerians whose experiences may not be shared by others. Thus, this research project might produce different findings given a larger and more diverse sample of participants.
And that concludes the first part of Chapter 3 in this third episode of the Immigrant Whisperer Podcast. Stay tuned for Part 2 of Chapter 3, where we'll meet the 11 research participants in my dissertation. Please subscribe and comment below to continue to support our work. All right, friends, I need a break after all this reading. Join me and explore Zucosa Fitness, our sister YouTube channel, for self-care through stretching, breathing, and dance routines. Take care, and I'll see you soon. Peace.